On that sunny morning at São Paulo International Airport, the atmosphere was a whirlwind of voices and hurried movements. Among spinning luggage on endless carousels and announcements echoing over loudspeakers, two worlds as distinct as they were incompatible were about to collide. On one side, Joaquim Oliveira, a 68-year-old man, walked slowly, his eyes filled with curiosity. It was his first time in an airport. He carried with him not only his battered suitcase, but also the innocence of someone who had always lived far from the complexities of urban life. His faded plaid shirt and straw hat marked his rural origins, while the smell of earth and animals clung to his clothes, telling stories of hard work and simplicity. On the other side of the same scene, Helena Mendonça glided through the terminal with the confidence of someone who believed the world existed to serve her. Dressed in a perfectly tailored designer outfit, she looked more like she was on a fashion runway than in an airport. Her high-heeled shoes, though impractical for the hustle of the environment, echoed as a reminder of her presence. Helena was a woman accustomed to luxury, to red carpets, and to exclusive places where money not only opened doors, but also kept away people she deemed unworthy. To her, simplicity was synonymous with inferiority. The two found themselves in line for first class, a place where Joaquim's presence was already seen as an anomaly by some judgmental glances. Helena, on the other hand, immediately noticed the contrast. The scent of the countryside that Joaquim carried proudly as a reflection of his life was to Helena an olfactory insult. Her expression of disgust was impossible to ignore. It took only a few seconds for her to break the silence with a cutting remark. "My God, it smells like someone brought an entire stable onto the plane." Joaquim, distracted by the view of the aircraft outside the window, took a moment to realize that the comment was directed at him. When he finally turned around, he met Helena's icy gaze. Confused, he asked with a polite smile, "Did you say something, ma'am?" Joaquim's gentle and respectful tone contrasted sharply with Helena's posture, who, without disguising her disdain, pointed at him as if he were an error in the system. "You must be in the wrong line. Economy class is up front." It was the first time Joaquim experienced unmasked prejudice, a disdain that didn't come cloaked in false politeness. It was direct, sharp, and struck him hard. But even in the face of humiliation, he remained calm, as someone accustomed to facing adversities greater than the inflated ego of a socialite. "No, no," he replied, showing his boarding pass with hands calloused from working the land. "The lady up front told me my place is here." The confirmation that Joaquim, a humble and simple man, would have a spot in first class seemed to be the last straw for Helena. She raised her voice, drawing the attention of other passengers and staff. "This is unacceptable. How can you allow such a thing? I demand that this man be relocated immediately." Her tone was that of someone who was used to being obeyed without question. On the other side of the counter, a young staff member, visibly intimidated, tried to calm her down. "Ma'am, he has a valid ticket." But Helena interrupted him with an impatient gesture. "Do you know who I am? My husband is a shareholder in this airline. If you don't resolve this now, I guarantee there will be consequences." Meanwhile, Joaquim, who had remained silent until then, began to feel the weight of all the eyes on him. Some passengers whispered among themselves, while others simply watched, perhaps waiting to see how the situation would unfold. He felt his face flush, not with anger, but with embarrassment, not for himself, but for the absurd situation being created. The airline supervisor arrived, accompanied by two security guards, and Helena immediately took the lead, explaining her indignation. Joaquim, for his part, tried to intervene, saying he didn't want to cause trouble. "If it's for the good of all, I'll go somewhere else," he said, with a humility that made the supervisor visibly uncomfortable. Then came the official announcement. "Sir, we regret the incident, but we ask that you accept being relocated to economy class." Without arguing, Joachim nodded. He didn't want to prolong the embarrassment for himself or for the staff. As he walked down the aisle toward economy class, he felt the pitying glances from some and the relieved looks from others. Behind him, Helena's voice echoed triumphantly. Finally, we can have a civilized trip. In the new row, squeezed between other passengers, Joachim sat in silence, holding a crumpled envelope in his shirt pocket. Inside was a recent medical diagnosis explaining why he was traveling to São Paulo, a terminal illness that left him with only a few years to live. He closed his eyes and tried to hold back tears. That trip, which should have been a moment of celebration and discovery, had turned into a bitter reminder of the divisions that still existed in the world. The episode was more than an affront to Joachim. It was a reflection of the invisible barriers that still separate people by class, appearance, and origin. Helena knew nothing about him, but assumed that due to his simplicity, he didn't belong in that space. Joachim, on the other hand, demonstrated a quiet strength, something she, with all her power and wealth, would never understand in that moment. The injustice and prejudice were explicit, but ironically, it would be that very incident that would spark a turn of events that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. Public humiliation is like an invisible blade. It cuts deep, leaving scars not always visible, but almost always felt. For Joaquim Oliveira, that day at the airport became a bitter symbol of how prejudice and arrogance can transform something simple into a devastating experience. As he was escorted by security to economy class, each step felt like it weighed a ton. It wasn't his luggage or the exhaustion of travel that made him hesitate. It was the overwhelming sensation of being judged, exposed, and diminished. In the aisle of the plane, the stares were unavoidable. Some people looked at him with pity, but most with indifference or even irritation. It wasn't just Helena who had judged Joachim. Many on that plane had done the same, even if silently. How many hadn't thought, upon seeing him in the first-class line, that there was some mistake, that a man like him, dressed so modestly, couldn't possibly occupy a place among the wealthiest and most privileged passengers. Upon reaching the back of the aircraft, where the seats were cramped and the air felt heavier, Joachim settled in silence. He felt as if he were carrying not only the weight of embarrassment on his shoulders, but also the shame of all those who had been humiliated for being who they are. The envelope in his pocket, containing the medical diagnosis, had become almost an anchor in that moment. He didn't take the paper out to read it, but he felt the burden of its implications. He was traveling to seek a second opinion, a last chance. And there he was, being judged not for his courage in facing his condition, but for the smell on his clothes. The humiliation Joachim felt was not merely a reflection of Helena's words. It stemmed from the very structure of how humans sometimes behave in groups. In social psychology, this is referred to as the bystander effect. When an individual is publicly humiliated, there is collective discomfort, yet few intervene. In Joachim's case, that discomfort manifested as hushed whispers, faces avoiding eye contact, and an indifference that screamed louder than any words. While Helena, in first class, celebrated her victory, the farmer gazed out the small airplane window at the world passing by outside. He thought of his late wife, who used to say that silence can be louder than a scream. He chose to remain silent, not because he was resigned, but because he knew words would not be enough to change the mindset of people like Helena. His silence, however, was loaded with dignity. It was not a silence of submission, but of resilience. For Helena, though, the incident was just another example of how power and money could bend the world around her. She was unaware that, at that very moment, her arrogance was being observed by other passengers. A woman sitting in the row beside her discreetly took out her phone and began recording the events. The story of Joachim and Helena would not be confined to that flight. It would be shared, discussed, and analyzed. There is something profoundly human about witnessing another person's humiliation, even from a distance. Perhaps it reminds us of our own vulnerability, of how fragile we are in the face of others' judgments. For many, the episode between Joachim and Helena was uncomfortable because it exposed that reality. Who hasn't feared being ridiculed, being pointed out, being marginalized? As the airplane ascended into the skies, Joachim leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes in an attempt to push away his thoughts. But Helena's words continued to echo in his mind, like a movie that couldn't be paused. Stable smell, you don't belong here. Unworthy of being in first class. He wondered if she truly understood what words like first class meant. For Joachim, first class was waking up before the sun to tend to his land. It was the smile of his son Pedro when he had a good harvest. It was the memory of his wife's laughter when she heard funny stories about the animals on the farm. For him, first class was the life he had built, with effort, honesty, and love. But at that moment, in an airplane crossing through the clouds, he was just a simple man forced to hide his dignity behind a heavy silence. The public humiliation, as he would come to realize later, was not just an attack on his person, but a blatant attempt to erase his story, to diminish everything he represented. And yet, even in that situation, Joachim held on to something that Helena, with all her wealth, could never buy: his integrity. The public humiliation Joachim experienced was merely the beginning of a journey he had yet to realize he was about to embark on. In that moment, he was a man trying to cope with the invisible wounds that prejudice had left behind. But as is the case in every good story, the deepest humiliations sometimes serve as catalysts for the most extraordinary transformations. What Joachim did not know, as he looked at the horizon through the airplane window, was that the same sky witnessing his pain would also be the stage for his redemption. Helena Mendonça grew up in a world where power was not just a word, but a tool shaped from an early age. The daughter of a traditional elite family from São Paulo, she learned that money not only buys material goods, but can also dictate rules, shape behaviors, and erase what is considered inconvenient. For her, power was something natural, almost a birthright. Since childhood, Helena was accustomed to being heard, obeyed, and admired, and any resistance to that dynamic was treated as a personal affront. When Helena encountered Joachim in that boarding line, the discomfort did not arise solely from the smell of his dirt and sweat-stained clothes. It also stemmed from what he symbolized. Joachim represented everything Helena had avoided in her life: hard work, simplicity, and a genuine connection to the world around her. To her, he was an intruder in a space she believed belonged exclusively to people like her. The smell of the farm, which for Joachim was the aroma of his history and effort, was for Helena a rupture in the perfectly controlled universe she inhabited. However, what Helena did not perceive, and what often remains invisible to the privileged, is that power can be a treacherous illusion. Her ability to humiliate Joachim and belittle him in that moment seemed to reinforce her dominance over the environment, but in reality, it was revealing her own insecurities. Helena did not just attack the smell or the clothes of Joachim. She attacked the possibility that someone could occupy that first-class space without carrying the same symbols of status that she valued so highly. It was as if Joachim's presence threatened to dismantle the carefully constructed facade that the world was perfectly divided between those who belong and those who do not. Helena's privilege was palpable in every gesture, in every word. She did not politely ask for someone to resolve what she considered a problem. She demanded. Her voice was not that of a dissatisfied customer, but of an authority, someone who knew that her position of power had consequences. By mentioning that her husband was a shareholder in the airline, Helena did what so many privileged individuals do. She wielded her proximity to corporate power as a weapon to reinforce her influence. But privilege is not just about what one has, it is also about what one does not see. Helena did not view Joachim as a complete human being, with a story, dreams, and struggles. To her, he was merely a nuisance, something to be removed so her luxury experience could remain intact. This is the most subtle and perhaps the most dangerous power of privilege, to dehumanize others in order to preserve a comfortable worldview. On the other side of this dynamic was Joachim, whose life represented a constant struggle. Unlike Helena, his power did not come from money or influence, but from his resilience and connection to the land. While she relied on privilege to open doors and shape situations, Joachim depended on his inner strength to overcome adversities. He knew what it was like to face drought, lose a harvest, and bury loved ones. For him, power was not something that could be imposed. It was something built day by day with humility and effort. However, in that airplane, Helena's power felt overwhelming. It wasn't only her who exerted pressure on Joachim. It was an entire system that allowed people like her to act without immediate consequences. When the airline supervisor acquiesced to Helena's request, it was not just out of fear of her influence, but because he, too, was part of a structure that privileges the voice of those with financial power over the dignity of those without. Helena's privilege was not just hers. It reflected how the world was organized. But power and privilege have their traps. While Helena sat comfortably in her first-class seat, savoring what she believed to be a victory, the world around her began to react. Just a few minutes passed before passengers, who had observed the scene with discomfort, started sharing their versions of the incident on social media. The power Helena had wielded to humiliate Joachim was about to turn against her, transforming into a weapon she could not control. This is the paradox of privilege. It can offer a sense of security and control, but when exposed, it reveals its fragility. Helena had the power to make Joachim leave first class, but she did not have the power to prevent her actions from being questioned and criticized. Unbeknownst to her, the seeds of her transformation were being planted at that moment. Joachim's humiliation, amplified by the gazes and cameras of the passengers, became a mirror reflecting the reality of how power and privilege can erode the humanity of those who wield it. Meanwhile, Joachim, sitting in his new seat in economy class, was not thinking about power or privilege. He was thinking about his son, his farm, and the diagnosis he had received. For him, the incident was just another obstacle, something he knew he could overcome, just as he had overcome many other hardships in his life. But the impact of that experience would not be limited to him. It was like a stone thrown into a calm lake, with ripples spreading far beyond what he could imagine. Helena, on the other hand, still did not realize what was to come. For her, power was still a constant, something she could use without question. But what she would learn, little by little, is that privilege is a coin with two sides. On one side, the ability to shape the world around you. On the other, the vulnerability of being disconnected from what truly matters. The incident on the airplane was not just an episode of humiliation, it was the beginning of a lesson that Helena and many others needed to learn. True power does not lie in subjugating others, but in understanding and connecting with them. Joachim instinctively knew this. Helena did not yet. But fate had plans to cross their paths again, and when that happened, power and privilege would be re-evaluated in a new light. A light that would shine not for money or influence, but for truth, humility, and above all, the capacity for change. After the flight, when Joachim disembarked in São Paulo, he seemed just another face in the crowd. But what he did not know was that for many people, he had already become a symbol of resilience and dignity. During the hours on the plane, and even before, his demeanor in the face of humiliation had not gone unnoticed. Some passengers felt embarrassed for not having acted in his defense, while others, inspired by his silent strength, decided to take action. At the moment the passengers began to disembark, what had happened on the airplane was already spreading. A video discreetly recorded by a passenger in economy class, which captured the moment Helena confronted Joachim, began circulating on social media. The title read, "Millionaire humiliates humble elderly man on flight. Is first class only for the rich?" The story quickly went viral, bringing thousands of comments, messages of support, and also fierce criticism of Helena's behavior. On the other side of the airport, while Joachim grabbed his worn suitcase and prepared to face the next challenge, a medical appointment filled with hopes and fears, he had no idea of the mobilization forming around him. Still in the terminal, a young woman who witnessed the incident approached him with a gentle smile. "Sir, I saw everything that happened on the plane." I just wanted to say that you were very strong. Can I help with anything? Joachim, surprised by the approach, replied with his usual humility, "No, my child, it's all right. Thank you for your concern." Solidarity, as often happens, began with small gestures. An airport employee, who had heard the story and recognized Joachim while he waited for a taxi, approached him and insisted that he accept a coffee at the local restaurant. "It's on the house, sir. Thank you for showing such dignity." Though reluctant to accept, Joachim gave in, feeling for the first time that he was not completely alone in this unfamiliar city. Meanwhile, online, the narrative was gaining larger proportions. People began sharing their own stories of discrimination and humiliation, many of which connected with what Joachim had faced. One woman recounted how she was rejected in a job interview because of her appearance, while a young man shared an experience where he was excluded from a social event for not wearing brand-name clothes. Each account revealed a common thread: the desire to be seen and valued for who they were, not for how they appeared. Back at the farm, news traveled quickly. Pedro, Joachim's son, received calls from friends and acquaintances asking if he had seen the video. Initially confused, he opened the link sent by a friend, and upon seeing the footage of his father confronted by Helena, felt a mix of indignation and pride. Pride because, even in the face of humiliation, his father maintained the calm and dignity that had always characterized him. Outrage because, as a son, he knew that the world was not always fair to people like Joachim, people who gave their all and were still underestimated. Pedro wasted no time. He wrote a message on social media saying, "This is my father, Joachim Oliveira, a simple, honest and hard-working man who taught me the value of humility and respect. He deserves every opportunity the world has to offer, and no one can take that away from him." The post quickly gained traction, receiving thousands of likes and shares. People began to mobilize not just to support Joachim, but also to share lessons about how small acts of solidarity can make a difference. The story didn't stop there. An organization fighting against discrimination in public spaces reached out to Pedro, offering legal assistance to ensure that the humiliation Joachim suffered would be formally addressed. Although Joachim was hesitant to seek retribution, Pedro convinced him that it wasn't just about them. "Dad, this isn't about us. It's about preventing others from going through the same thing. It's about giving a voice to those who don't have one." Nice. After reflecting, Joachim agreed, more out of love for his son than any desire for revenge. The solidarity wasn't only virtual. Neighboring farmers, upon hearing about the incident, organized a group visit to Joachim's farm, bringing words of support and even small donations, such as seeds and tools. "You are an example for all of us," one of the farmers said. "You've shown that it's possible to face adversity with your head held high." Joachim, moved, warmly thanked everyone, even though he continued to feel unworthy of such attention. Meanwhile, in São Paulo, Helena was beginning to feel the effects of what she had set in motion. Negative comments flooded her social media, and the story reached the press. Helena was not used to being confronted, but for the first time in her life, she began to realize that the power and privilege she had always taken for granted were being questioned by a much larger force: collective empathy. For Joachim, the experience brought an unexpected lesson. Although the initial humiliation had been hard to bear, the gestures of solidarity showed him that humanity was still capable of uniting in the face of injustice. He understood that even in the midst of pain, there was kindness, and perhaps more importantly, he realized that his story, so simple and everyday, could be a catalyst for something much greater. In the days that followed, as he walked through the fields of his farm at sunset, Joachim reflected on how that episode had revealed the strength of human connections. Solidarity, he concluded, was like the soil he cultivated. Even when it seemed dry and barren, all it needed was a bit of care and attention for something beautiful to bloom. The The pursuit of justice, he mused, is often a long and uncertain road, but it can also be a transformative journey. For Joaquim Oliveira, the idea of pursuing a legal case against Helena Mendonça seemed unnecessary, almost absurd. He was a man accustomed to dealing with the world's injustices practically, accepting them as part of life. But this time, the scale of the incident and the support he received made him reconsider. It all started when Pedro, his son, returned from the city with news. A renowned human rights attorney, moved by Joaquim's story, offered her services to help him seek redress. "Dad, she doesn't just want to defend you. She wants to make this an example, a message for everyone who has suffered like you did," Pedro explained. Joaquim, with his serene gaze and measured words, replied, "I don't know if the world changes with a lawsuit, my son, but if this can help others, maybe it's worth a try." In the days that followed, Joaquim and Pedro spent hours talking with the attorney, recalling the details of the incident. Each word brought to light not only the humiliation he endured, but also the strength he showed in facing it. The attorney, touched by his story, saw a unique opportunity to highlight important issues surrounding prejudice, discrimination, and abuse of power. More than just an individual case, this would serve as a landmark to broaden the discussion about how behaviors like Helena's were still accepted in many spaces. As the case took shape, Helena, on the other side of the story, experienced moments of tension. Accustomed to controlling her image and actions, she now found herself in an uncomfortable position. Her public relations team initially tried to downplay the incident's impact, suggesting vague statements and protocol apologies. But the public would not accept it. The narrative had already spread beyond her control, and the call for genuine redress only grew louder. In a twist, Helena was officially notified of the lawsuit filed by Joaquim. As she read the petition, she felt for the first time the real weight of her actions. It was not just a legal matter, it was a direct confrontation with the choices she had made, with the values she had always considered unquestionable. "How did this happen?" she asked herself aloud while looking out the window of her luxurious office. Deep down, Helena knew that this question was not just about the present. It was about years of behavior shaped by a system that told her that with money and influence, she would never have to face the consequences of her actions. As the attorneys prepared their arguments, a public hearing became inevitable. The media, always eager for stories that capture the masses' attention, began to follow the case with enthusiasm. Reporters tried to interview Joaquim at his farm, but he, true to his reserved nature, limited himself to saying, "I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing this for everyone who has gone through something like this." The day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed with people from different backgrounds, eager to witness the unfolding of a case that was already deemed emblematic. Joaquim, dressed in his best outfit, a simple but clean and well-pressed cotton shirt, entered the courtroom with the calm demeanor that defined him. By his side, Pedro offered silent support, a gesture that meant more than words could express. On the other side, Helena arrived accompanied by her legal team, wearing a discreet outfit that contrasted with her usual style. It was clear that she wanted to soften her image, but her eyes still carried the arrogance that marked her personality. When the two met for the first time since the incident on the plane, Helena tried to hold Joaquim's gaze, but ultimately looked away, as if facing something larger than she had expected. No tribunal, the story was recounted in detail, with testimonies from passengers who were on the plane, videos recorded on cell phones, and emotional accounts that confirmed the humiliation suffered by Joaquim. But the most poignant moment came when Joaquim was called to testify. He didn't use grandiose language or try to paint himself as a hero. With a calm and steady voice, he spoke about how that moment made him question if, in such a divided world, there was still room for people like him, simple yet dignified individuals who lived to work, love their families, and leave a legacy. "I wish no harm upon anyone," Joaquim said, looking directly at Helena. "But what happened that day didn't just happen to me. It happened to all those who have ever been treated as less than human because of how they dress, how they smell, or where they come from." and that needs to stop." These words resonated in the courtroom and beyond. At that moment, even Helena felt something break within her. It was impossible to deny the truth Joachim brought forth. This was not merely a dispute between two individuals. It was a struggle for dignity, recognition, and justice. The trial didn't end with a dramatic twist or a spectacular finale. However, the court's decision, a public apology from Helena, a significant financial settlement directed towards social projects in the countryside, and a promise to review discrimination policies by the airlines, represented a victory not just for Joachim, but for many. More than that, it planted the seeds for a change that would affect the lives of all involved. As Joachim left the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and supporters, he made sure to say, "This is not the story of how I won a lawsuit. It's the story of how together we can make the world confront the wrongs it still commits. It's not about me, it's about all of us." As the sun began to set on the horizon of São Paulo, marking the end of that day of justice, Helena left the courthouse in silence. For the first time, she didn't feel she could rely on power or privilege to escape. She felt that to change the narrative of her own life, she would need to learn to look beyond herself. And somehow, she knew that this process didn't end there. It was the beginning of something greater, for Joachim, for herself, and for everyone willing to listen. The case of Joaquim Oliveira against Helena Mendonça not only stirred the courtroom, but also became a spark of awareness that echoed far beyond the walls of the judicial system. The trial, widely covered by the media, brought to light long-buried issues of social coexistence, prejudice, inequality, and the impact of privilege. Each new headline, each comment on social media, each conversation among friends seemed to revolve around the same question: what does this say about us as a society? The video of the incident, which was once just another cell phone recording, became a powerful symbol. It was shared millions of times, accompanied by messages of support for Joachim and sharp criticism of Helena's attitude. People began to reflect on their own experiences and question their own behaviors. "How many times have I judged someone by what they wore or where they came from?" wrote a young woman on her personal page. "I can't change what I did in the past, but I can be better in the future." This collective reflection generated a domino effect. Schools and universities began to use the case as a theme for debates and lectures, emphasizing the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their background or social standing. Non-governmental organizations launched awareness campaigns, encouraging people to recognize and challenge their own prejudices. The most popular slogan was simple yet powerful: "Look beyond the surface." One of the most memorable moments of this wave of awareness occurred when a public school in rural Minas Gerais held an event called Joachim Day. In it, children and young people were invited to wear simple clothes like those of rural workers and share stories about their families. "My grandfather was like Mr. Joachim," a 10-year-old girl said into the microphone, moving the audience. "He worked the land and always said that what matters is not what you have, but what you do for others." Meanwhile, Joachim, back on his farm, began to realize the impact his story was having. He received letters from people all over the country, thanking him for his courage and for giving a voice to those who were often ignored. Some messages were from young people who felt inspired by his resilience. Others were from elderly individuals who saw in him a reflection of their own struggles. Joachim read each letter carefully, keeping them in a box he affectionately called the echoes of the world. But the awareness didn't just touch the spectators of the case, it also began to profoundly affect the protagonists. Helena, who had initially resisted any idea of change, found herself increasingly confronted by the consequences of her actions. In an interview for a television program, she was asked what she had learned from the episode. For a moment, the woman who always had a prepared answer fell silent. Then, with a deep sigh, she said, "I learned that the power I thought I had wasn't real. The true power lies in recognizing our faults and trying to correct them." This statement, although criticized by some as too late or insufficient, marked a turning point for Helena. she began seeking ways to contribute positively to society. Inspired by the impact Joachim was having, she offered to fund educational programs that taught empathy and inclusion. It was a small gesture compared to the harm caused, but for Helena, it was the beginning of a journey to reconnect with something she had long lost: her humanity. Joachim's story also sparked curiosity about life in the countryside and the reality of rural workers. Television programs and documentaries began to explore the daily lives of people like him, highlighting the challenges they faced, but also the beauty and resilience that permeated their lives. In one of these documentaries, Joachim was invited to showcase his farm and speak about what it meant to him to care for the land. "Here lies the story of my family," he said, pointing to a lush green field. "Every piece of this land holds the sweat and love of generations. That's why I do what I do. It's not for the money, but for what it represents." The awareness also brought changes in corporate policies. The airline involved in the case announced a complete overhaul of its employee training, emphasizing the importance of treating all passengers with respect and equality. They also promised to implement diversity and inclusion programs to combat internal prejudices. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. However, perhaps the most significant impact was the one that couldn't be measured by numbers or headlines: the silent, almost invisible impact on the everyday lives of people. It was the father who now taught his son the importance of respecting those who are different. It was the young person who reconsidered their sarcastic comments about someone they saw on public transport. It was the woman who, upon seeing a farm worker in the city, saw not a stranger, but a story. In the end, the awareness generated by Joachim's case didn't change the world overnight, but it ignited a flame. And as Joachim knew better than anyone, it only takes a small seed for something extraordinary to bloom. As he walked through the fields of his farm at dusk, he looked up at the sky and thought about the letters, the voices, the stories that were now connected to his. He knew that his struggle had gone beyond his own pain. It had become a beacon, lighting a path that many others could follow. Thus, the awareness that began as a reflection of an injustice transformed into a force capable of uniting, inspiring, and above all, changing hearts. Sometimes life presents us with moments that act as mirrors, reflecting not only who we are, but who we could be. For Joaquim Oliveira and Helena Mendonça, the incident on the plane became that mirror, forcing both of them to confront their truths. But what each of them saw when they looked into the reflection. Back at his farm, Joachim felt the weight of what he had experienced, but also the relief of being home again. The green hills, the sound of birds at dawn, and the smell of damp earth reminded him of who he was, where he came from, and what truly mattered. "The city is too big, filled with voices that confuse," he told Pedro one morning as they walked through the fields. "But here I remember that the most important things are quiet. They grow slowly, like a seed in the ground." Although Joachim had faced humiliation with dignity, the episode led him to reflect on the fragility of human relationships. How could a simple prejudice cause so much pain? He began to think not only of what he had suffered, but also of what others endured daily, often without the support he had received. This reflection motivated him to open the doors of his farm to local youth, teaching them about sustainable agriculture and the importance of respecting the land and one another. "If we want to change the world," he said, "we need to start with what's within our reach. Planting respect is like planting a field. It takes time, but it bears fruit." As Joachim immersed himself in the simplicity of his reflections, Helena faced a different kind of mirror, one that couldn't be easily ignored. In her luxurious apartment, surrounded by works of art and designer furniture, she felt the weight of silence. Previously, she found solace in her busy routine and the glitz of social parties. But now, every moment of tranquility brought questions she didn't know how to answer. "Who am I, beyond money and power? was the one that haunted her the most. Helena's journey toward reflection began unexpectedly. One afternoon, while reviewing documents in her office, she stumbled upon an old notebook that belonged to her mother. Among the yellowed pages, there was a note that read, "The true value of a person is not in what they possess, but in what they share." These words, simple yet profound, awakened a memory from her childhood when her mother organized donations for underprivileged families in the area. Helena realized that at some point in her life, she had lost touch with those values. Determined to reclaim something she felt was missing, Helena started visiting rural communities to better understand the challenges faced by people like Joachim. At first, her presence was met with suspicion, and rightly so. But over time, she learned to listen, something she hadn't done in a long time. "It's not about what I can give," she told herself during one of these visits. "It's about what I can learn." These experiences not only changed her, but also helped her view the airplane incident from a new perspective. She realized that her behavior wasn't a reflection of strength, as she had thought at the time, but of weakness. A weakness rooted in the fear of losing control, in the fear of confronting her own vulnerability. Acknowledging this was painful, but also liberating. As Joachim and Helena continued their journeys of reflection, their stories began to intertwine in unexpected ways. Pedro, noticing the changes in Helena's demeanor, suggested she visit the farm. "I think my dad would like to hear what you have to say," he said. Helena, hesitant, accepted the invitation. When Helena arrived at the farm, the scene she found was like something out of a painting. The late afternoon sun bathed the fields in golden light, and Joachim was sitting on his porch reading one of the many letters he had received since the incident. Upon seeing her, he didn't show surprise, but he didn't hide his caution either. "Ms. Mendonça," he said calmly, "what brings you here?" Helena took a deep breath before responding. "I came to thank you, Mr. Joachim, for showing me something I had forgotten. And also, I came to sincerely apologize." There was sincerity in her voice, and it touched something deep within Joachim. He paused for a moment before saying, "Life has curious ways of teaching us, doesn't it? I accept your apology. But tell me, what will you do with what you've learned?" That question lingered with Helena long after her visit to the farm. She knew that words, no matter how sincere, were not enough. Action was necessary. Inspired by Joachim, she began investing in programs that promoted inclusion and respect, especially in rural communities. She also became a public advocate against discrimination, sharing her own story as an example of how prejudice can be confronted and overcome. The reflections of Joachim and Helena were not easy for either of them, but they were transformative. For Joachim, it reaffirmed his faith in human kindness and the power of simplicity. For Helena, it brought a new purpose, a chance to rewrite her story. And for all who followed their journeys, it was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is space for growth, reconciliation, and change. As the sun set once again over the farm, Joachim looked out at the horizon and smiled. He knew that, although the incident on the plane had been painful, he had planted seeds of reflection that would continue to bloom, not just for him, but for everyone who chose to look beyond the surface and see the humanity in each person. Reflection only gains meaning when it transforms into action. For Joachim Oliveira, Helena Mendonça, and all those who followed his story, this maxim became a call to arms. The incident on the plane, which began as a moment of humiliation, had evolved into something much greater, an opportunity to act and change the world around them. Back at his farm, Joachim wasted no time. The months that followed the trial were dedicated to a project he had been envisioning for years, a sustainable irrigation system that could revolutionize family farming in arid regions. For Joachim, this was not just a technological innovation, it was a way to give back the support he had received from so many people. "If my story has touched lives," he said, "then let this system transform lands." The initiative was named Aguas do Amanhã, a name that carried the hope of a better future. However, the work required effort and collaboration. Pedro, Joachim's son, took on the practical leadership of the project, while Louis, his fiancée, contributed her organizational and creative skills. Together, they began to create prototypes and test them in different parts of the farm. Curious neighboring farmers started to appear, offering help and bringing ideas. In no time, Joaquim's farm became a living laboratory of innovation and solidarity. But the project wouldn't have gained so much momentum without an unlikely ally, Helena Mendonça. After her visit to the farm, Helena, driven by the desire to redeem herself, offered her financial support and business expertise to expand the initiative's reach. "I want what you are doing here to reach places you've never imagined," she said during a meeting with Joaquim and his team. Although many still viewed her involvement with skepticism, Joaquim, with his characteristic wisdom, explained, "If life gives us a second chance, why not accept it?" Helena used her influence to organize launch events and gather partners for Aguas do Amanhã. One of these occasions was a conference in São Paulo, where Joaquim, for the first time, took the stage to share his vision. "The land teaches us many things," he said, holding the microphone with hands that still bore the marks of years of hard work. "It teaches us that to reap something of value, we must care for, nurture, and protect it. I believe this applies to everything in life, our families, our communities, and even our second chances." His words brought the audience to their feet, and the project received donations that ensured its expansion to other states. Meanwhile, Helena began transforming her own company. Mendonça Empreendimentos, once solely profit-focused, started incorporating values of social responsibility into its projects. Helena decided to dedicate a significant portion of the profits to finance inclusion programs, especially in rural areas. More than a strategic change, it was a change of heart. For her, each initiative was a brick in the reconstruction of something that had broken within her. The impact of Joaquim and Helena's actions began to spread in ways they could never have imagined. In small communities in the northeastern hinterlands, farmers started implementing the irrigation system developed on Joaquim's farm, watching their once dry lands come to life again. Families that had given up on farming began to rebuild their hopes. "This system changed everything for us," said a farmer during a television news report. "Now we can plant year-round and feed our children with what the land gives us." However, the most powerful changes were not those that appeared in the media or at grand events. They were the transformations that occurred in people's hearts. In schools, children began studying the story of Joaquim and Helena as an example of how respect and empathy can change lives. "Who here wants to be like Mr. Joaquim?" a teacher would ask, and every hand in the room would shoot up. For Joaquim, the greatest fruit of his efforts came on a peaceful afternoon when Pedro and Luis announced that they were expecting a child. Joaquim, moved, embraced them both and said, "This is the true legacy. It's not what we leave in the soil, but what we leave in people. May this little one know that they come from a family that believes in the power of kindness." Lee. As the years went by, Aguas do Amanhã became a national reference, and the Oliveira farm was transformed into a center for learning and innovation. Helena, now a frequent presence at the farm, helped organize workshops and lectures, often reflecting on her own journey. "I thought I knew what power was," she said, "but I discovered that true power is when we use our hands to lift others." In the end, the action that began as a response to injustice became a network of change that impacted thousands. And as Joaquim, now aged, watched the sunset from his porch, he knew he had done more than overcome the humiliation suffered on that plain. He had planted a future. "The land is wise," he would say to anyone who would listen. "If you take good care of it, it will give you everything back, and a little more." And so, the cycle was complete. The incident that began as an open wound turned into a story of transformation, showing that when reflection leads to action, the impact can be infinite. Joaquim knew he wouldn't see all the fruits of his labor, but that didn't concern him. "The best seeds are those we plant, knowing that others will reap," he would say with a smile. And for him, that was more than enough.